come home before the ideology forgets your name. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that many Jews on the left are still trying to name. It is not the heartbreak of losing a political argument or discovering that someone disagrees with you on tax policy, climate policy, policing, the Supreme Court, or whatever fresh outrage the algorithm served for breakfast. Jews can survive arguments. We turned disagreement into a sacred literature, added footnotes, argued with the footnotes, and called it Talmud. This is something deeper. This is the heartbreak of discovering that the moral community you trusted had conditions attached. I have watched Jews who spent years trying to be compassionate, careful, informed, and decent suddenly realize that the movements they trusted came with fine print. Not obvious fine print, of course. The dangerous kind never is. It hides in the moral footnotes until Jews need the same empathy they were told to extend to everyone else. Many Jews did not become progressive because they hated Judaism. In many cases, they moved left because something in them was profoundly Jewish. They cared about the vulnerable. They distrusted cruelty. They believed history imposes moral obligations. They felt, sometimes without knowing the Hebrew, the force of tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Their instinct was not foreign to Judaism. Their instinct came from Judaism, even if no one had ever taught them where the instinct was born. That is why this conversation must begin with compassion. The point is not to mock Jews who believed progressivism was a moral home. The point is to ask what happens when that home suddenly develops fine print. What happens when institutions that speak constantly about trauma, safety, dignity, and marginalized identity become vague when Jews are afraid? What happens when people who built entire moral vocabularies around listening to minorities suddenly treat Jewish testimony as a public relations inconvenience? This is not an abstract concern. American Jews are not a powerful majority complaining about hurt feelings because someone did not like their brunch politics. Pew Research Center estimated that Jews make up about 2.4% of U.S. adults, a tiny minority by any honest demographic measure. Pew also found that American Jews are overwhelmingly liberal and democratic. About 7 in 10 Jewish adults identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party, and half described their political views as liberal. In other words, when we talk about Jews feeling abandoned by progressive spaces, we are not talking about outsiders looking in. We are talking about people who helped build those rooms. Citation Pew Research Center, Jewish Americans in 2020. That is what makes the betrayal so painful. Many Jews on the left spent years showing up for other people's fear, other people's pain, other people's vulnerability, and other people's dignity. They marched, donated, posted, organized, taught, listened, apologized, learned the new vocabulary, and tried to be on the right side of every moral emergency. Then, when Jews needed the same clarity returned, too many found equivocation, silence, suspicion, or the strange demand that Jewish grief first pass an ideological screening process. The evidence is not just emotional. The ADL recorded 8,873 anti Semitic incidents in the United States in 2023, the highest number the organization had recorded since it began tracking incidents in 1979. Its 2024 audit reported 9,354 incidents, a further increase, and again, the highest level recorded in the history of the audit. Those numbers include harassment, vandalism, and assault. They also reflect something less easily counted: the daily atmosphere in which Jews are deciding whether to tuck in a necklace, remove a mezuzah from a dorm room door, avoid a conversation in class, lower their voice in public, or tell their children not to say too much. That is not paranoia. That is a community reading the room and realizing the room has changed. Citation ADL, Audit of Anti-Semitic Incidents 2023 and 2024. The FBI data points in the same direction. ADL's analysis of FBI hate crime statistics reported that anti-Jewish hate crimes made up nearly 70% of religion-based hate crimes in 2024, even though Jews are only a small fraction of the American population. That gap matters. It is one thing to say anti-Semitism is a problem in theory. It is another to look honestly at the numbers and admit that Jews are experiencing a level of targeted hostility wildly disproportionate to their size. Citation ADL Analysis of FBI Hate Crime Statistics, 2024. The campus data should especially trouble Jews who still believe academic spaces are naturally safer, wiser, or more morally serious than the broader culture. Hillel International and AJC's 2025 data found that 42% of American Jewish college students reported experiencing anti Semitism on campus. The same release described many Jewish students altering how they show up on campus, including avoiding expressions of Jewish identity or views about Israel out of fear. That is not a healthy intellectual culture. That is a warning light blinking in the faculty lounge while everyone argues over the thermostat. Citation: Hillel International and AJC, State of Antisemitism in America, 2025 Campus Data. AJC's broader 2024 survey found that 93% of American Jewish adults said anti Semitism is a problem in the United States, and 54% called it a very serious problem. This is not fringe panic. This is a mainstream Jewish perception across a community that is politically diverse, religiously diverse, geographically dispersed, and famously unable to agree on what time dinner should start. When more than 9 in 10 Jews say there is a problem, serious people should stop telling Jews they are imagining it. Citation: AJC, State of Anti-Semitism in America, 2024 report. This is where the conversation must become honest. The problem is not that Jews cared too much about justice. The problem is that too many were taught to seek Jewish justice everywhere except Judaism. They were taught slogans, but not sources. They were taught repair the world, but not the Jewish discipline and obligation behind Tikkun Olam. They were taught to admire prophetic ethics, but not to read the prophets as Jews. They inherited Jewish moral instincts without Jewish literacy, which is like inheriting a mansion and being told you are only allowed to live in the garage. That Jewish illiteracy has consequences. A Jew who does not know Jewish history is easier to shame. A Jew detached from Hebrew and peoplehood is easier to persuade that Jewish sovereignty is an embarrassing modern invention rather than a 3,000-year thread of memory and survival. A Jew who thinks Judaism is only trauma and holidays is easier to convince it has nothing serious to say about power, dignity, nationhood, law, ethics, or survival. Pew's research on Jewish identity helps explain the gap. Pew found that only 11% of U.S. Jews said being Jewish is mainly about religion alone, while many more described it as a matter of culture, ancestry, or some combination of identity markers. That is not bad. Judaism has always been more than a religion in the narrow modern sense. We are a people, a civilization, a covenant, a family, a language, a law, a land, a memory, and a calendar. But when Jewish identity becomes mostly cultural without learning, practice, or peoplehood, it can become emotionally meaningful but intellectually fragile. Citation: Pew Research Center, Jewish Identity and Belief, 2021. And fragile identities often look for stronger structures to inhabit. For many Jews, progressivism offered that structure. It supplied language, community, moral hierarchy, rituals of belonging, sins, confessions, saints, heretics, and excommunications. In other words, it behaved less like a politics and more like a replacement religion. The tragedy is not that Jews cared about justice. The tragedy is that some were encouraged to treat progressive approval as morally superior to Jewish continuity. That bargain has failed because no healthy identity can be built on self erasure. It failed because universal compassion without rooted obligation becomes performance. It failed because a Jew who can quote every fashionable theorist but cannot explain the Shema has been robbed of an inheritance. And no ideology that requires Jews to become smaller, quieter, thinner, and less attached to one another deserves custody of the Jewish future. The answer is not to tell every Jew on the left to become politically conservative. That is not the argument, and it is not the goal. Jews do not need another political costume. We need a return to Jewish seriousness. We need Jews who can participate in civic life without outsourcing their conscience to movements that do not carry Jewish memory. We need Jews who understand that no political party, activist network, university department, or social theory gets to sit above Judaism and decide when Jewish survival is morally acceptable. Judaism does not ask Jews to stop caring about the world. It teaches Jews how to care about the world without disappearing into it. It begins with obligation. Honor your parents, teach your children, pursue justice, remember you were slaves in Egypt. Rest one day a week, tell the story, light the candles, sanctify time. Argue with God if you must, but do not forget who you are while doing it. This is why come home is not a demand for instant religiosity. Nobody is asking a secular Jew to wake up tomorrow morning as the Rambam with a Costco membership. Return can begin with one mitzvah, one book, one Hebrew word, one Shabbat dinner, one synagogue visit, one serious conversation with a grandparent, one refusal to be embarrassed by Jewish belonging. Return does not have to be dramatic to be real. Most Jewish revolutions begin with someone lighting a candle and pretending they are not crying. For Jews on the left, this return may feel complicated because they have been taught to fear particularism. But Jewish particularism is not a rejection of humanity. It is the rooted place from which Jews learn responsibility. A person who loves everyone equally in theory, but has no concrete obligations in practice, is not morally advanced. He is just spiritually unassigned. Judaism teaches that love has order: family, community, people, stranger, world. Not because outsiders do not matter, God forbid, but because responsibility becomes real when it has names, faces, meals, funerals, weddings, children, and debts you cannot outsource. The left-leaning Jew does not need to abandon compassion to return to Judaism. He needs to stop treating Jewish self-erasure as proof of compassion. She does not need to stop caring about justice. She needs to remember that justice did not begin in a graduate seminar. It thundered from Sinai, argued in the Talmud, sang in Hebrew, survived exile, crossed oceans, hid in prayer books, whispered in camps, fought in ghettos, rebuilt in Jerusalem, and still waits every Friday night under the soft light of candles. There is also a moral danger in allowing other people to define Judaism for Jews. When hostile voices define Zionism, many Jews become ashamed of a liberation movement they were never properly taught. When hostile voices define Jewish peoplehood, many Jews begin to mistake solidarity with other Jews for tribal sin. When hostile voices define Jewish power, many Jews forget that Jewish powerlessness was not morally purifying. It was catastrophic. A people that remembers history clearly should not romanticize helplessness. This is not a call to abandon criticism, complexity, or conscience. Judaism is not afraid of hard questions. It is made of hard questions. The Jewish tradition can handle argument about God, law, power, ethics, war, peace, nationalism, exile, sovereignty, and justice. What it cannot survive is indifference. What it cannot survive is a generation that knows how to analyze every identity except its own. What it cannot survive is Jews who think their ancestors carried 3,000 years of memory across deserts, oceans, ghettos, and graves, so their grandchildren could be embarrassed at dinner parties. So the invitation must be compassionate, but it must not be weak. To every Jew on the left who feels politically homeless, spiritually bruised, morally betrayed, or quietly unsure why the old slogans no longer feel like shelter, come home. Bring your questions. Bring your ideals. Bring your doubts. Bring your politics if you must. Bring your discomfort with Hebrew school, synagogue dues, God language, bad sermons, and the rabbi who once spoke for 40 minutes when 12 would have been a mitzvah. Judaism can handle all of it. We have survived Pharaoh, Babylon, Rome, exile, inquisitions, pogroms, fascism, communism, terrorism, assimilation, and Hebrew school carpool. We can survive your questions, but bring them into the Jewish house. Do not leave them outside with people who want your ethics, but not your peoplehood, your trauma, but not your sovereignty, your humor, but not your seriousness, your food, but not your covenant. Come home before the ideology forgets your name. Come home before your children inherit opinions instead of memory. Come home before Jewish identity becomes something you defend only when it is attacked, rather than something you live because it is beautiful. Come home not because the world is ugly, although lately it has been putting in overtime. Come home because Judaism is true, deep, demanding, ancient, alive, and yours. The books are waiting, the candles are ready, the door is open, and your people need you. Am Yisrael Chai. If you enjoy my writing, support me by buying my book, Screaming into the Void, available on paperback or Kindle on Amazon.com.